Nobody raised you, and somehow you turned out to be the one raising everyone else. If you were born between 1965 and 1972, you've spent your life being the person everyone counts on and the person nobody thinks to check on. Not because they don't care, but because you made it look so easy, they assumed you were fine. You weren't always fine. You just never said that out loud. What the world calls your independence wasn't a choice. It was a survival architecture, built in an empty house while the rest of the world was looking the other way. There is a very specific, silent psychology behind why you became this pillar, and it started decades before you ever entered a boardroom or a delivery room. To understand why you're so exhausted now, we have to look at what was actually installed in your nervous system back then. Let's start with something that might actually surprise you. Your generation makes up about 20 of the adult population, but Gen X women hold a disproportionate share of leadership roles across virtually every sector. Not because they campaigned for visibility, not because they had a movement behind them, but because they were simply the ones who kept solving the problems everyone else walked away from. No trend pieces, no magazine covers, no hashtags. Just women who walked into the room, read the situation, figured out what needed to happen, and handled it. The same way they'd been handling things since they were 9 years old. And here's what makes the female version of this story different from the general Gen X narrative. The men in this generation adapted and led. These women did that too, but they also absorbed something else entirely. They took on the emotional architecture of every environment they entered, the family, the workplace, the social group, and they held it steady without ever being asked to, and without ever being thanked for it. You probably know exactly who I'm talking about because you've either watched her or you are her. She's the woman at work that everyone goes to, not her manager, not HR, her. The one in the family who quietly coordinates everything, the parents' medical appointments, the siblings' crisis, the holiday that would fall apart if she didn't start planning it in September. Her name only comes up when something needs fixing. When things are running smoothly, she's invisible. When something breaks, she's the first call. And the thing that gets missed completely in almost every conversation about Gen X women is that this pattern didn't emerge from ambition. It didn't come from a personality type or a drive to lead. It came from something that was installed much earlier, under very different conditions, in a context that had nothing to do with career ladders or professional identity. Psychology calls it a parentified child, when a kid takes on adult-level responsibility before they're developmentally ready for it. For Gen X girls specifically, that parentification had two layers. The practical layer, managing the house, supervising younger siblings, making decisions adults weren't around to make. And the emotional layer, which was holding the family's anxiety together quietly so nobody else had to feel it. That second layer is the one that never gets talked about. Because what looked like maturity from the outside was actually a nervous system learning at a very young age that the most effective way to feel safe was to make sure everyone around you was okay first. The reason this pattern exists in so many women from this cohort isn't personality, it's architecture. And it was built decades before any of them ever entered a workplace. More than 90 of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed. If you're starting to realize that your independence wasn't a choice, but a survival strategy you've been carrying for 50 years, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, share this with one person who needs to hear this. Now let's continue. To understand how that architecture got built, you have to go back to a very specific set of circumstances that shaped this cohort in ways that are still running in the background today. Girls born between 1965 and 1972 grew up during one of the least supervised childhoods in modern history. Divorce rates hit their peak right when these kids were young enough for it to reshape everything. Both parents entered the workforce out of necessity, not ideology, and the systems designed to catch the gap affordable after-school care, community support structures, any kind of institutional safety net, they didn't exist yet. So these kids caught themselves. They came home to an empty house, made their own food, managed their own afternoons, and figured out solutions to problems that most adults would find stressful. A broken lock, a sick sibling, a neighbor who needed something, the pilot light going out with nobody to call. But here's the layer that applied specifically to girls, and it's the one that gets left out of the general Gen X story. Boys in this era were largely left to their own devices in that empty house. Girls were handed the house. There's a meaningful difference between those two experiences. A girl coming home to an empty house in 1975 wasn't just managing herself. She was often managing younger siblings, starting dinner, monitoring homework, keeping the household running until a parent came home exhausted at 7. She was doing the emotional and logistical labor of a parent while still being a child, and everyone around her treated it as completely normal. They called her responsible. They called her mature. She's so good with the little ones. What they were actually watching was a 10-year-old quietly absorbing the message that her needs came last, that the way to earn love and stability was to be useful, and that flagging her own distress was a disruption nobody had bandwidth for. That's not a personality trait. That's a survival adaptation the nervous system makes when it learns, early and repeatedly, that needing people is a liability. Psychologists who study attachment and early adversity describe this as a hyper-activated caregiving response, where a child becomes so attuned to managing others' needs that their own internal signals start getting filtered out. Not suppressed intentionally, just deprioritized, so consistently and for so long that eventually the brain stops sending those signals with any urgency. And here's what that means in practical terms 50 years later. Asking for help still feels wrong. Not uncomfortable in the way that it's slightly awkward wrong, in the way that the body resists it, the way a person finds themselves saying, "I'm fine," before they've even assessed whether they actually are. In their 50s, carrying more than one person should be carrying, these women still default to solving it themselves first, second, and usually last. Not because they're stubborn, because their nervous system built a very clear model of what competence means, and that model doesn't include raising your hand. Nobody called it neglect. They called it freedom. They called it independence. They said she never needed much, and what they didn't realize was that she simply learned to stop asking. And the thing is, she did become extraordinary. The self-reliance is real. The capability is genuine. The ability to walk into a broken situation and fix it without drama or visible distress, that's not performance. That's a skill that got built through repetition across an entire childhood. But the same wiring that made these women exceptional also set up a very specific burnout pattern that's surfacing right now in their 50s in ways that are hard to name because they don't look like what most people imagine burnout looks like. That part comes next. There was something else running in the background of these women's childhoods that almost nobody factors in when they try to understand this generation. Something that didn't happen once and leave a mark. It was constant, ambient, woven into the ordinary texture of daily life. They grew up during the Cold War, not as a historical period they'd later study, as the actual sound in their house. The evening news wasn't background noise. It was a nightly update on how close everything was to ending. The drills at school, where a teacher told a room full of children to get under a wooden desk, those drills didn't communicate safety. They communicated that the adults responsible for the world had built a situation serious enough to require practicing for it, and that a desk was the best solution anyone had come up with. That detail matters, because it told the generation of children very clearly that the people in charge didn't have this figured out. For girls specifically, there was an additional layer to how that anxiety landed. Boys got to be loud about it, got to channel it into anger or humor or the performative nihilism that would later become grunge. Girls were socialized to absorb it quietly, to hold the emotional temperature of the room steady, to not alarm other people, to manage their own fear in private. The Cold War dread didn't get expressed, it got internalized, and it built something. In 1983, 100 million Americans watched a television movie called The Day After. It depicted a nuclear strike in graphic, unflinching detail, not as science fiction, but as a realistic simulation of what Tuesday could look like. The women in this cohort were between 11 and 18. They watched it, went to bed, and went to school the next morning. No counseling, no structured processing, just the implicit instruction that functioning normally afterward was the expected response. The Challenger explosion in 1986 hit differently. This one wasn't about dread. It was about hope falling apart in real time. Some of these women watched it live in classrooms, the event framed as a moment of national pride, a teacher going to space. And then it wasn't. That specific experience, watching something publicly designated as progress and possibility just disintegrate, left a particular residue. Not grief exactly, more like a recalibration, a quiet decision that optimism needed to be earned before it was offered. Then in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The thing their entire childhood had been organized around, the background hum of nuclear dread that had never fully gone quiet, just stopped. And nobody said anything meaningful about it. No acknowledgement that these women had spent their formative years carrying that weight. No space to process that it was over. No conversation about what it had cost. The world moved on, and so did they, because moving on without processing was a skill they'd been practicing since they were 9. What all of this built wasn't paranoia, it was pragmatism at a cellular level. If everything can end on a random Tuesday, you stop waiting for the right conditions, and you start handling what's in front of you right now. That's not cynicism. That's a nervous system that learned to function under uncertainty by refusing to let uncertainty be an obstacle. People watched these women shrug at things that made others panic and called it apathy, called them slackers, called them emotionally unavailable. But they weren't checked out. They'd just decided early and permanently that panic was an inefficient use of time. So they skipped it and got to work. Here's the data point that almost nobody talks about. Gen X currently reports the highest burnout rates of any living generation, higher than Gen Z, higher than millennials. And the female version of that number is worse than the general figure suggests, because women in this cohort aren't just carrying a demanding career, they're carrying everything simultaneously. And they've been doing it long enough that they've stopped registering it as unusual. This is the sandwich generation in its most literal form. Aging parents who need more support every year, adult or near-adult children who still need a soft place to land, careers that reached their most demanding phase right at the moment everything else did too. 3 separate gravitational pulls, all operating at full strength, all expecting the same woman to show up completely. And she does. That's the part that doesn't get acknowledged enough. She actually does it. But the reason it stays silent is the same reason it started. The nervous system adaptation that made these women so capable, the one built in those empty houses, calibrated against Cold War background noise, also made them unable to read their own distress accurately. Their internal baseline for fine was set so high, so early, that what would register as a crisis for someone else reads as a Tuesday for them. They're not minimizing the exhaustion. They genuinely can't always locate it until it's been running for years. So what does burnout actually look like for a woman who was trained from childhood to absorb pressure without visible reaction? It doesn't look like collapse. It looks like wear. An irritability that wasn't there 5 years ago. A short fuse with the people closest to her, the ones she's most sure won't leave. A tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that's in the bones rather than the eyes. A specific kind of loneliness that's almost impossible to explain to anyone because she's surrounded by people every single day, people who need her, people who love her, and yet she feels completely unseen. Not unloved, unseen. There's a difference, and most people in her life have never thought to ask which one she's feeling. And if she's partnered, there's a real chance the person next to her is carrying the same weight in silence. 2 people who were both raised to handle things alone, lying in the same bed, neither one saying it out loud. The therapy gap in this cohort makes that worse. A significant majority of Gen X women grew up with real adversity, family instability, emotional unavailability, the kind of chronic, low-level stress that doesn't get called trauma because nothing dramatic enough happened to justify the label. And almost none of it ever got addressed. Not because these women are avoidant in any pathological sense, because they were taught, by example and by omission, that the correct response to hard things was performance. You work harder, you achieve more, you stay useful. The pain either goes away or it doesn't, but either way, you don't stop moving long enough to find out. That strategy worked for a long time. It genuinely did. But it has a shelf life. What's surfacing now, in their 50s, isn't weakness. It's the accumulated weight of decades of competence deployed without recovery. Psychologists describe this as a caregiving debt, the gap between what a person gives and what they allow themselves to receive, widened year after year until the math becomes unsustainable. Being needed and being supported are not the same thing. For many of these women, nobody has ever said that directly to them before. Not because it isn't true, because everyone around them got so used to them being fine, the checking became unnecessary. But the burnout isn't the whole story. What these women did with that pain, quietly, deliberately, across an entire generation, is something the world gave someone else credit for. Here's the thing most people miss when they talk about this generation, and it's the part worth getting exactly right. These women were raised by people who loved them. That's not in question. But love, in that era, in those households, didn't come with emotional language. Nobody sat across from a 10-year-old Gen X girl and asked how she was really doing. Nobody named what she was feeling or gave her a framework for it. Feelings were either fine or not fine, and either way, dinner still needed to be on the table. So when these women had their own children, they did something that had no template. They made it up from the absence. They asked their kids how they felt. They said, "I love you," out loud, unprompted, on ordinary days. They sat with their children's distress instead of redirecting it toward productivity. They learned words for emotional states they'd never been taught themselves: anxiety, disappointment, grief, shame. And they handed those words to their kids like tools, because they understood from lived experience exactly what it costs to go through life without them. That didn't come from a parenting book. It came from a woman who remembered exactly what it felt like to be 9 years old and holding everything together with nobody asking if she was okay. There's a generation right now that gets a lot of cultural credit for normalizing therapy, for building emotional vocabulary into daily life, for making it acceptable to say, "I'm struggling," without losing status. And they deserve that credit. But they learned to do it somewhere. They grew up in homes where the emotional scaffolding had already been built, by mothers who constructed it without any instructions, while simultaneously working full-time, holding the sandwich generation together, and never once saying, "Look what I did." These women laid every brick and watched someone else put their name on the building. There's a psychological cost to that, too. Not bitterness exactly, something quieter. A kind of weariness that comes from doing significant things in invisible ways for so long that invisibility stops feeling like a circumstance and starts feeling like an identity. They don't seek validation because they stopped expecting it young. They don't broadcast their struggles because they never learned that broadcasting was an option. They show up, handle what needs handling, and go home. And if you push past the armor, the dry humor, the competence, the absolute refusal to make their pain someone else's problem, what you find is someone who gave her children the emotional world she never had, who built stability for everyone around her out of instability, who processed decades of unaddressed weight through sheer forward motion. That's not invisible. It's just quiet. And quiet doesn't need applause to be real. The psychology of Gen X women isn't a story of neglect, but a testament to what a person builds when they are forced to become their own foundation. You didn't just survive an empty house, you built an emotional world for others out of the exact silence you grew up in. More than 50 of people have already clicked away by now. If you're still here, you're already processing things on a level most people simply aren't ready for. That usually means you've found a piece of truth here that your nervous system has been waiting to hear for 50 years. And the next video is where we look at the one thing you still find impossible to trust, and why that's the final key to your recovery.